physics. Neither of them has been quite content to remain in its own homestead, but that, whereas each has its own method, which is the best for its purposes whatever, and has at different times thought to impose it upon the other, to the disparagement or rejection of that opposite method, which legitimately belongs to it. Clearly, Hawking and Mlodinow have rejected philosophy, and given their press release soundbite that God isn't necessary, it would seem that they have rejected theology as well. If philosophers have not kept up with contemporary developments in science, does that mean that they should be drawing upon the latest findings of physicists in order to formulate their answers to these questions? And what about theologians? Should they be rejecting the Bible simply because it's not a scientific treatise? To proceed, let us look at Newman's claims about something called natural theology. Newman explains that while knowledge of the natural world is marked by the progress of science, knowledge of the supernatural world is not progressive because theology is the contemplation of God's revelation. Newman's basic point is that scientific knowledge progresses by developing new theories while freely discarding old theories as more data becomes available for research. Theology is not progressive because new doctrines are not replaced by old ones. Revelation is already complete. We are not adding new books to the Bible. Our theological understanding of Revelation may deepen, but Revelation itself is not an ongoing accumulation of supernatural data. In other words, doctrine may develop in order to better understand God's revelation, but theology does not improve upon God's revelation. I just want to emphasize that. When you think about science and the way it develops, and the way a new theory can replace an old theory, and theories can be thrown out, that doesn't happen, properly speaking, in theology. Anything that's been established as a doctrine in theology cannot be discarded. Its understanding may be challenged, it may need to be deepened. But this is a fundamental difference between the way that science develops and theology. Now, even natural theology, which is the study of the natural world from a philosophical perspective that is open to the question of God in the absence of revealed truth, while drawing upon the theories and data of progressive science, is not itself progressive. Moreover, Newman claims that technological progress does not produce progress in theology, whether it is natural or supernatural theology. In its attempt to establish the doctrines of theology without drawing upon the tradition and the teachings of the Catholic Church, natural theology proposes the existence of a supreme being by arguing that the design of a creator can be found within the data of science. Although Newman accepts the argument of design that it is important to some people, he insists that natural theology, which relies upon human reason, can only establish three attributes of a supreme being, namely power, wisdom, and goodness. However, the progress of science does not contribute to the force of the argument of design, because it can be made just as well by reflecting on the existence of plants and animals without the aid of science, as was shown by William Paley. That was in the 18th century. Moreover, the argument of design does not depend upon the philosophy of science proposed by Francis Bacon in the 16th, 17th century. Newman realizes that some people believe that natural theology can be used to draw upon the discoveries of science in support of Christianity, but he argues that it can actually be used against Christianity. In response to the release of Hawking's book, the Jesuit philosopher Father Robert Spitzer, president of the Magi Center for Faith and Reason, tries to turn Hawking on his head by arguing that if the universe does come from nothing, there must be a transcendent power that caused it to be.
It is for these three reasons, then, that I find these conclusions of Dr. Hawking, well, challenging at best, very questionable and dubious at worst. Because after all, number one, he's already assuming a creation or a beginning. It's the only reason you would want to justify how the universe could create itself out of nothing without a God. Number two, There is a lot of evidence out there from space-time geometry, from the Borda-Vilenkin and Guth theorem, from the Borda and Vilenkin proof in 1993, from the law of entropy, which suggest from physics that the universe itself had a beginning, or any multiverse in which it could be situated, that also had a beginning. And thirdly, the claim that Dr. Hawking makes really is self-contradictory, because if the law of gravity, a physical reality, existed while the universe supposedly did not exist and was nothing, then of course we have an obvious contradiction.
Spitzer writes elsewhere, in my view, Dr. Hawking has not yet shown the non-necessity of this reality of God. Indeed, he implies it by assuming the existence of a beginning in his assertion about the universe coming from nothing. Now, here I would like to suggest we see Spitzer doing exactly what Newman cautions against. The mathematician and physicists are claiming that they have a theory that demonstrates how the universe could come into existence without the first cause religious people call God, and the philosopher here, Father Spitzer, is claiming that this is not logically possible for something to come from nothing. Therefore, there must be a God who caused the universe to exist. Do you see a problem here for this religious person to enter into this kind of debate? Do you see how a philosopher who is a Catholic priest is trying to draw upon the latest theories of physics to demonstrate the existence of God, but seems to have unknowingly reduced God to Aristotle's prime mover, the first cause without a cause? In my estimation, this philosopher has taken the physicist's notion of causality and tried to use it to support a theological doctrine. Newman's response to these attempts is emphatic. I quote, "I say that natural theology cannot, from the nature of the case, tell us one word about Christianity proper. It could not be Christian in any true sense at all." And he goes even further, stating that, quote, "I do not hesitate to say that, taking men as they are, this so-called science, natural theology, tends, if it occupies the mind, to dispose it against Christianity. And for this plain reason, because it speaks only of laws and cannot contemplate their suspension, that is, miracles, which are of the essence of the idea of revelation. Thus, the God of natural theology may very easily become a mere idol." And I would add, an idol that makes an easy target for atheists to knock down when they encounter with the latest scientific developments that explain what natural theology took to be an unsolvable mystery pointing to God. So this raises a question, perhaps at this point for some discussion. Should Christians be trying to keep up with the developments in physics or, say, evolutionary biology, the sciences, in order to present updated arguments from natural theology to support a belief in the existence of God? Anybody want to respond to that? Should we be engaging like Father Spitzer? Yes, please.
My point is that science, that's theory. So, 100 years ago, that before Big Bang, you didn't know about it was a stable universe or an expanding universe. But it was decidable by scientific observation. Now, religion is a story. It's a story about a God, his son, and you can't, this thing, truth, can't go against truth.
Mm-hmm.
There are two different divisions, there are two different realms. So there's no way on earth you're going to find a scientific evidence that Jesus resurrected and went to heaven. So this looking for support for things like that in science, I think, is a blind alley to the religious person.
Certainly, ultimately, when it comes to faith in Jesus Christ. But what about someone who's doesn't believe in God at all, and we're trying to move them at least to think of the possibility that there could be a creator? And that's really what people who propose natural theology or even intelligent design, that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, but what can they say about this created more than that it was the first cause? We don't need a first cause.
That's what Hawking's saying, exactly.
We don't need it.
Yes, please.
On a similar note, however, We know that the sciences deal with what can be measured. So I don't fully understand with Father Spitzer's argument on how understanding modern sciences can necessarily give us an understanding of supernatural, which is certainly beyond measurement.
What he's doing there is he's quoting other theories that leave for a possibility of a first cause. It's also been called the God of the gaps kind of theories, where a theologian or philosopher looks at the scientific theories, and there's a point where it seems to be that there has to be something beyond the theory to make this work, or at least an opening there, and then the person postulates, well, that must be God. But then over time, that theory is either thrown out, or it's refined, or is developed, and that gap is closed, and then what? Then the person who proposed this as a proof for the existence of God can't say anything.
Right. I mean, it might just be an extension of what Hawkins is doing now, pretty much using Occam's razor.
I wonder about that. We'll have to come back to that. So I'm not simply asking whether these arguments from natural theology, arguments of design, are effective in persuading atheist scientists to become believers. That may be possible. Although Christians in the past quite reasonably turned to natural theology, should Christians be more cautious today about finding God in the gaps of contemporary science? After all, as a matter of principle, Newman says he views natural theology with great suspicion. I'm concerned that these arguments may, as Newman cautions, backfire and misrepresent the Christian faith by leaving Christ out of the equation. Natural theology, which is essentially arguments from philosophy, may be good at persuading some people that there is a God, but it cannot say who God is. We can only know who God is by way of God's self-revelation, and for Christians, this means God's self-revelation in the person of Jesus Christ. I want to leave this for now and go on to the next lecture that Newman gave to the School of Science. In the lecture to the School of Science, Newman describes the habits of thinking that someone should develop while studying at university. Although a university education should include science, it cannot be reduced to scientific thinking. Addressing the audience, he explains, here, and he's speaking to men, "Here, gentlemen, we recognize the special character of the philosophy I'm speaking of, if philosophy it is to be called, in contrast with the method of a strict science or system. Its teaching is not found on one idea or reducible to certain formulae. Newton might discover the great law of motion in the physical world and the key to 10,000 phenomena, and a similar resolution of complex facts into simple principles may be possible in other departments of nature, but the great universe itself, moral and material, sensible and supernatural, cannot be gauged and meted by even the greatest of human intellects, and its constituent parts admit indeed of comparison and adjustment, but not of fusion." So on the one hand, Newman understands knowledge to be universal and whole. On the other hand, no one person can know everything. Maybe there was a time that was possible, but not now. Yet any one person should have a sense of what they know and what they do not know. Moreover, while the whole of knowledge consists of parts, we are not able to fuse these parts into a whole. In order to kind of get a handle of this situation, Newman proposes 3 maxims that should be followed by anyone schooled in the philosophy imparted by a proper university education. So what I'll call the cardinal maxim, it is that truth cannot be contrary to truth. The second is that truth often seems contrary to truth. And the third is that we must be patient with such appearances of apparent contradictory truths and not be hasty to pronounce them to be readily of a more formidable character. These maxims develop a sensibility for discrimination, that is, an ability to recognize, for lack of a better term, the proper realms or boundaries of a discipline. Newman says that, quote, if true representative defines rather than analyzes, He aims at no